Hey guys, Matthew here. I have a quick word for those of you who are active in local churches. You see, I don't just do podcast stuff. I'm a pastor, and every church has had to level up their online presence the past few years. The days of stealing, yes, stealing images from Google are over, my friends. So if you're thinking about leveling up or you just don't know how to get to the next level, can I point you over to my friends at Rethinking Evangelism? I've talked about them before, but they've got a free PDF that will help you figure out how your church can get access to millions of stock photos and templates for free. You have the rights to them and everything. Your whole church team can use them. I've done it. It works. There's no reason not to know about this. So if that sounds about right, head over to rethinkingevangelism.co/history and sign up for the free Rethinking Evangelism guide. That's rethinkingevangelism.co/history. Check it out. I'll put the link in the show notes. Okay, on with the show. Now, on a personal note, I want to invite you listeners to take our spring survey. This is an opportunity for you to let us know what you think of this podcast as well as our other podcasts and give some feedback to our hosts. How are they doing? What sort of things are we doing well? What do we need to improve on? That's what the spring survey is all about. You can take it over at AdventistHistoryPodcast.org. It's right there on the front page. Just scroll down a little. I would appreciate it if you have 3 or 4 minutes out of your day to do that. Thanks.
And Jesus himself said that he did not come to do away with the law.
He does not take us out of this world if he does not want us to be contaminated by it.
This is the Adventist Pilgrimage Podcast with your hosts, Michael Campbell and Greg Howell.
I'm Michael Campbell with the Adventist Pilgrimage Podcast. I've got my buddy Greg, and here we are. We've got a couple of our very dear friends, part of the Adventist History Podcast Network. We've got Matthew Lucio, the eminent Matthew Lucio, and we have beloved professor from Southern, Dr. Jud Lake, with the Ellen White Podcast. So welcome.
Oh, it's good to be here, Michael.
Yep, good to be here.
Great. Well, we're here because we're friends, fellow historians, fellow podcasters, and today we want to talk just a little bit about what seems a little bit unusual because we're historians. Historians are always talking about you have to always be objective, but we're also Adventists and care deeply about our history, about our faith, our community. And recently there's been a new podcast, and it really shouldn't surprise us because there's always been criticisms. There's critics of every movement, right? But there's one particular podcast that I think kind of got us all talking, and so that's hence we're going to start a new series that we want to delve into that pertains to some of the criticisms of Adventism, of Ellen White, and just try to unpack that a little bit and give kind of the rest of the story, the other side. And so let's talk just briefly, apologetics. Jud, what is apologetics?
Apologetics, yeah. Well, it's not saying I'm sorry.
Okay.
It comes from the Greek word apologia, which is used several times in the New Testament, which its root idea is a defense. And it was used in the sense of a defense of the gospel. And over time, it's evolved into the idea of apologetics, Christian apologetics, the enterprise of defending the Christian faith, defending the existence of God and the resurrection of Christ and the divinity of Christ and those big issues related to Christianity. That's apologetics. And in a more narrow sense, we use it in the context of Adventism because Adventism has been under attack. The Adventist apologetics, the defense of Adventism. Francis D. Nichol had done a lot of that in the mid-20th century, and a well-known Adventist apologist. And then you've got the criticisms of Ellen White, and responses to that are Ellen White apologetics. So I like to define it as defending the gospel, Ellen White apologetics, or Adventist apologetics, as defending the gospel in the context of Adventism or Ellen White.
Yeah. So, I was part of a community organization that, I showed up for the board, and one of the other ladies that was just a fellow Christian in the community just came loaded and, you're not a Christian and you worship Ellen White and her writings and stuff like that. And I tried to be as disarming as I could, but all of the things I heard her accusing me of, I didn't recognize. I was like, well, that's not really what I believe, but I'm not saying you have to be Adventist, but I wish, just at least fairly portray, what my faith is, just as I would want to fairly hopefully, try to objectively and fairly portray someone else's faith that I don't necessarily adhere to, right? And so part of what we're trying to do, and, the reason we're here is new podcasts. It shouldn't surprise us. There's been critics. I keep wanting to call it cultfish, but I know it's cultish.
Cultfish.
Cultish apologia.
I think Cultfish is going to be our next podcast. I think that sounds great.
Yeah, so maybe like a fish fry or something. I don't know.
And no offense to the official
No
Cultish
offense to the official
website.
one. I'm sorry. It sticks out in my mind. But we, I was listening to some of the episodes, and I know, each of us kind of listened to some of that stuff. And I felt the same way. I had that same kind of response, like, wait a minute. Yeah, there's criticisms, and there are criticisms. We were talking before in preparation for this that there's a grain of truth in every criticism. Jud, you were commenting about that, I think, right?
Yeah, and reflecting on the interview at the Cultish Apologia site. Of course, they were it's more about Proclamation. That's an organization that are a group of former Adventists who have great concerns about Seventh-day Adventism, and over the years have made their main focus on dealing with Adventist beliefs and attempting to criticize them and so forth. So that's more what it was about. The host of Apologia, or Cultish Apologia, they were interviewing the two of the main leaders of the Proclamation organization. But as I listened to it, I have some observations about the host. That the two gentlemen interviewing them struck me as just intelligent, fine Christian men who are very dedicated to the gospel and defending the gospel. The website's quite impressive. I haven't had the opportunity to listen to all of the different episodes on there, but they deal with all the cults, Jehovah's Witness, Mormons, and New Age, and a host of other ones like that. And of course, now there's 4 episodes on Seventh-day Adventism. And as I listened to the interviewers, the questions they asked, I thought were very intelligent and thoughtful questions. The issue I had was with the answers that they got. The answers seemed to be very biased, and they reflected a very narrow view of Adventism, more the experience of the 2 interviewees, their upbringing in Adventism, which was quite different from many people I know that love Jesus and had a good experience in Adventism. And I'm sorry that their experience was not good, but to make that all of Adventism, that was the false narrative that I repeatedly heard. And what concerned me the most was that the host appeared to believe it as if it were gospel. In other words, they took it as that's Adventism. That's what Adventists really believe about the gospel, and that's what they believe about Christ, and that's what they believe about this terrible Ellen White, and so forth. That, I think to all of us, that was certainly the most concerning, and to anybody who appreciates Adventism and heard that, and of course, a number have asked us to respond to this. I know, Michael, you've had a number of people, myself as well, but anyway, my observations are positive towards the interviewers. They seem to have come with a pre-understanding already, which didn't seem positive about Adventism, but at the same time, they were seeking earnest questions, and it's just what struck me, I suppose, the most was if that's all they did. I mean, they 4 episodes and they're done, and it was all interviewing these 2 individuals. That's one side. Did they consider interviewing actual experts in Adventism about Adventism, such as historians and theologians? That they only gave one side and didn't hear the other side. That's what I think obviously concerns all of us, and that's what we're about here, is to give the full picture.
But let's be honest, because I think there's room for us to be mildly hypocritical here, because I think when we listen to the episodes about the Jehovah's Witnesses, we're not like, well, why didn't they get a Jehovah's Witness on there? Or when we listen to an episode about a Mormon, we don't say, well, why didn't they get more Mormons on there? Now, maybe they did. I don't know. I didn't listen to those episodes. But I think it's just a human
I didn't either.
thing that we're willing to kind of believe there's only one side of the story, so long as it's about somebody else. And then when it comes to us, we're like, well, why didn't they get a second opinion here? And as I was watching one of the episodes on YouTube, they were saying, Adventists are so deceptive. They'll say one thing publicly because they want to snow you, but they really don't mean what they say. And I'm thinking, boy, that's how some Adventists used to talk about Catholics. Now it's being used against us, and we think it's unfair.
I can also tell you that would take a mass.
And I said earlier,
that would take a massively unified effort on our part to consistently do that, and I don't think we could pull it off. People. We're not all that good at deceiving.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the great. That's the great irony. Is
something I mentioned before in our conversation is that I believe that there's a core of truth in every criticism, and while I certainly disagreed with the overall narrative that I heard, at the same time, there's a lot of self-reflection we can do. Because Adventism is not perfect. We made mistakes, and there are pockets of legalism within Adventism and so forth. And I think there's a lot we can learn personally as we reflect on these type of things, as you said, and not be hypocritical.
Yeah, because to me, the truth is that the criticisms they have and the feeling that they had that they escaped something that was negative and didn't truly contribute to an experience of the gospel, I feel, and maybe that's because I'm still part of the organization, but I feel mildly responsible for that, and I feel bad that is the experience of Adventism they had. And that is probably why I would want to stay in Adventism, because I want to help fix those kinds of problems.
Oh, okay. That's good. Michael, you had something you wanted to chip in with?
Well, I was just going to say, I do think, from a standpoint, we believe or have a bias where we want to believe those negative things. But I've taught for a number of years world religions, and that was one of my favorite classes, honors class. And I would take my students to not only learn about them, but have people from each of the different religious groups. So if we're talking about Buddhism, I'd have a Buddhist priest, or Islam, I'd have an imam come and talk. And we actually did 3 site visits. And what I wanted to do was so that it wasn't a class like, where I was trying to deconvert my students, right? I wasn't trying to get them but I was trying to create the religious literacy so that if they met someone from each of these different world religions, different groups, and most of my students were Protestant, some were Adventist, but I had a very diverse group. And so I try to give them some exposure, and I called it holy envy, right? So let's assume the best about each of these religious groups and something that we admire or like about each of them. And I think that's an approach that we should kind of take, to be charitable with those that we disagree with. I'm not a Mormon. I'm not Jehovah's Witness. I know they're on the hit list of cults or whatever you want to call it, but it doesn't mean that all those people are terrible. And the same thing with Adventism is, okay, if you're going to say all these criticisms and stuff like that, sometimes they may be partially justified because maybe someone's had a bad experience or run into an extreme form of Adventism. But what we're trying to do is say Adventism at its best. Adventism, or for example, Ellen White, we're going to talk about that over the next few episodes too, I'm sure, that, what does that look like if, in a healthy and balanced way? If Ellen White were still alive, how would she want us to understand her writings, right? So if we were to see that, and what I've grown to appreciate in my personal experiences, she points me to Jesus and to be more deeply anchored in the authority and primacy of Scripture. And that's what I love about Adventism. That's made Adventism contagious, and why I choose to continue to be an Adventist. I'm not perfect. Adventism's not perfect, but is there another side of the story? That's what this podcast is trying to do, is kind of show, hey, there's another side. And And like you guys were talking about before, there's a lot of people asking questions like, oh, there's all these things that are going on or they're being said. Is there resources? So instead of taking my word for it, or any of us that are on this podcast episode, right, not taking our word for it, go study for yourself. And part of what we want to do is we want to talk about some of those criticisms. How do Adventists understand or deal with them? And what I hope we'll do is also point people to some key resources. Okay, you want to do that deep dive on whatever XYZ as we talk. We're not going to do that in this first episode. We're just kind of getting warmed up. But hey, here's more information. Here's the rest of the story, so that hopefully you can see that there's not only just the critics and the criticisms, but here's how, albeit sometimes imperfectly, but here's how Adventists understand and approach these kinds of topics. And
I think, Michael, it's not just we've been using this language like there's another side to the story, but the reality is sometimes I feel like these critiques are like critiques of 1950s Adventism. I mean, Adventists Today just published an article that asked whether Ellen White was an alcoholic. I mean,
my goodness,
the way that sometimes these people, I don't want to go there right now. That's a whole different.
You just opened that can of worms, Matthew.
I'm going to go talk to my therapist about that. But, my point is this would be inconceivable that this would get published and see the light of day in the 1950s, 60s. Right? Yeah. I mean, just inconceivable.
Wasn't what people are talking about. Yeah.
No, and even kind of more progressive members we're not going to be daring to voice that publicly. But my point is like when they describe the Adventist Church as this place where it's a hugely deceptive atmosphere, and like the official narrative is for public, or for public outside consumption is dishonest, and I agree with Greg in saying like we are not capable of pulling off that kind of conspiracy. First of all. Second of all, like, are you aware of what's going on in Adventism today? Like, do you honestly think the General Conference, for all their good intentions, has a monopoly on how Adventist views get out there? Like, are you not aware of the diversity of views within Adventism? And I just feel like they're having a conversation with an Adventist church that doesn't exist anymore.
And that we have this control on people's lives like a cult.
Right.
And persecute them if they leave, and tell them what to believe, and have absolute control. The bites that was mentioned in there, that's where people are shaking their heads and say, that's not the Adventism I knew. Now, admittedly, there may be homes, families where you have that type of control. And maybe there are groups, and I'm sure there are. In fact, I can verify. I know that there are churches, some smaller churches that exercise that type of control. But here's the big issue. That's not the whole. That's not the whole. That's only a small part. And what the interviewees did is paint the part as the whole. And that's the problem.
As a pastor, I was never able to control what my members believed. Never.
You're going to do
That's for sure.
The NLP didn't work. I wasn't good enough at it because everybody wanted to believe anything, and I was constantly putting out those fires. It did not work. Somebody didn't give that to me.
Yeah, if only pastors knew how to really do that.
I'm going to get you a T-shirt, Greg, and be like, I wish we were a cult.
I could have used some of those skills at various controversies in my time.
But I mean, this brings up this. Here's my chief problem, and it has, I know we'll get in future episodes to specific claims and accusations. But my biggest problem, it's something I've dealt with in YouTube videos for my church and elsewhere, is this word cult. I've said it in the episodes we did on the Questions on Doctrine, the 7 episodes we did for the Adventist History Podcast, and I'll say it again. I think this is a problematic word, because it has whatever meaning somebody wants to attribute to it, and it can be used to club somebody over the head or a group of people over the head. And so basically I can define it however I want, and then it has it's universally loathed. Like nobody wants to belong to a cult. There's no good way to put a spin on being a member of a cult. And so I can give it whatever meaning I want, and then stick that label on somebody and then denounce them. And I just, like, it's not a biblical term. it's not a term that has kind of any inherent agreed upon meaning. Like we generally associate it with maybe a charismatic leader who exerts a toxic level of control over their followers. But if that's the meaning that we mean by cult, then it certainly doesn't apply to Adventists. Not in any grand scale.
Especially in the classic definition of a cult by evangelicals, is that someone who rejects the salvific work of Jesus Christ and rejects his divinity and his personhood, who he is, his eternal nature, and so forth. And that does not apply to Adventism as a whole or Adventism in its theological history.
Right, and I think
that's debatable. I know, but if you really do the research, it doesn't.
But here's the deal: like, I feel like we by default do some obeisance to Walter Martin, but it's like, who set up the evangelicals as the judge of what a cult is?
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Like, what if we want to consider Calvinists a cult? You know, like, I felt
like we were talking about heresy, not cultic practices per se. There's heretical forms, but that's based on who gets to call heresy.
And this term cult has a history itself, right? It comes back to the fundamentalist movement of the 1910s and 20s. And what they were trying to do is react and respond to the modernists who were undermining the veracity of miracles and the authority of Scripture and the reality of the atonement of Jesus Christ and all of those things, right? So they're fighting against on one side, but then they're also kind of setting boundaries and saying, well, you Mormons aren't part of us because you don't believe Scripture the same way we do. And so it's beginning to exclude certain groups because here's who's in, who's safe, and here's who's out, right? And the initial list of cults, Adventists didn't make the very first round, but within the second and third round of cults through the 1920s, very quickly Adventists got lumped in there with everyone else. So, but yeah, it's not a very nice term. It's not a friendly term, and it kind of gives this sort of impression of a mindless adherence to something where people are being manipulated. At least that's kind of my takeaway or impression of the term. But there's a history to the term, and that's why we don't like it, right?
And Michael, interestingly, to add on to what you said, well said, is that especially prior to 1950, and afterward, the main understanding of Adventism as a cult by evangelicals came from Canright, D.M. Canright, the well-known Adventist pastor who left Adventism the last 30 years of his life, criticized it and so forth, and launched a major campaign against it. And his ideas are what led them to believe. His criticisms of his former church are what led them to understand Adventists as a cult. And there's an interesting parallel today because here these former Adventists who are following in Canright's path are now giving to evangelicals this, what they perceive as this cultic view, this cultic sense of Adventism. So very interesting parallel historically.
Yeah. Sometimes I wonder if we're our own worst enemies, right? And I think, Matthew, you were talking about this, right? I mean, or Greg, the different kind of Adventism, 1950s, 60s Adventism, a time of strong emphasis of perfectionism, maybe a neo-fundamentalism, if you please, but certainly not the Adventism that I resonate with. And so part of what we're dealing with is if we have people that believe in inerrancy and infallibility of Ellen White, which is kind of Canright's big hang up, right, Jud? And so if he kind of has if people go from one extreme of viewing her on a pedestal and that sort of thing, and then kind of swing to the opposite and then just kind of reject her completely. And part of what I think we're trying to do in this podcast over the next couple episodes show is there's maybe a mediating approach that isn't quite so extreme. But there does seem to be this pattern in critics where it seems that they were exposed for whatever reason, for good or ill, to maybe a very different form of Adventism than I'm familiar with that might have elevated Ellen White in a pedestal or seen her as inerrant and infallible. And unfortunately, that's just not the Adventism that I know or want to espouse, even though I will acknowledge that there are people that misuse and abuse her writings, right?
Sure. Yeah. Sure.
I'm just thinking of the Roger Coons saying that that many people view Ellen White as a vegetarian Virgin Mary. But
Yes.
when they do that, that's the extreme, and the tendency is to swing back to the other side of the pendulum from a vegetarian Virgin Mary to a vegetarian Satanic Mary.
Oh,
And
mercy.
that's what
you heard
have
it from
with-
Dr.
with-
Lake first.
And there is the real Ellen White of history is very different
Yes.
from what we heard on this podcast, and is somewhere
And
in
this
the
is
middle.
true
It is
of
far
all
from
religious
those
movements.
extremes.
People will elevate a leader and put them on a pedestal, and there are these sort of patterns that can happen historiographically too, if I'm hearing you right.
yeah.
For sure.
And I think that there's something that I don't know that listeners who are not Adventists will be able to appreciate, but we're surrounded by a Christian culture in America that has been dominated by evangelicals for many decades now, and before them, some fundamentalists as well. And there's something uniquely frustrating when the more dominant strains of Christianity kind of pick on you. And I'm not saying that there aren't things to pick on in Adventism or Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons or any other group. But I think when you have a whole ministry dedicated to picking on those things, A, you can end up having a blind spot to things in your own camp. And B, it's kind of hard because if you're in one of those minority Christian groups, you can't really answer back because they have the bully pulpit. I am thankful that we have podcasts now and YouTube, and it kind of can level the playing field a little bit. So to me, this is an opportunity not to kind of return fire or get revenge. It's not about any of that stuff. It's just, hey, I think we've been misunderstood. And you guys have had such a big megaphone for so many years that it's good to hear from us, from people who I think you guys are sane. They're sane Adventists.
Matthew.
You're welcome.
Try to be.
Don't talk to my former churches, but I appreciate that.
Aspiring cult leader there, Greg Howell. I think you guys are sane, and I think I understand people are going to look and say, well, they're Adventists, and I think all of us are employed by the church in some way, shape, or form. So they're going to say, well, they're biased. Well, so are people who leave the church, right? I mean,
Exactly.
There's bias everywhere. It doesn't mean you're discredited. It does mean you should take this with a little bit of a grain of salt. An ex-Adventist it may have a little bit of an axe to grind. A presently employed by the church Adventist may be a little more sympathetic to the church. Those are the biases that we live and work with. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't listen to either side, because then who are you going to listen to? So anyways, I'm glad that we have an opportunity to present what I hope is a more accurate look at Adventism from people who are on the inside and who are reasonable people.
I hope so.
I'm going to quote you on
Absolutely.
that, Matthew.
What, that you're saying?
Yeah.
And a good
reasonable.
way forward would be
right.
a good way forward would be to really give our answers to some of the questions that the host asked of the interviewees
absolutely.
in that
And
podcast.
I think that's what we're
And
gonna-
how would we answer those questions? They were, as I said before, they were good, thoughtful questions. And how would we respond and provide another side?
I love
Yeah.
it. And then point people to resources, right? So
Yes.
don't just take our word for it, but
Yeah.
hey, here's something. If you're really concerned about this particular issue, here's a article or book or whatever, so you can investigate for yourself. So
Yeah. Anyways, the funny thing about all of this stuff, from fundamentalism to questions in doctrine to today, is we actually have a lot in common with evangelicals. But sometimes I feel like the dialogue can get rather unfortunately heated, and there's a lot of misunderstandings and stuff. And maybe that comes because we are so close. But hey, if the people from Cultish or fans of Cultish are listening, it's not that there's a beef with evangelicals. I think with the advent of this secular age, as Charles Taylor calls it, we actually have a lot of common causes here in terms of promoting Christian literacy in society. We want to see healthy churches. We lament shrinking churches. We want to see Jesus be known in this society.
Absolutely.
We have a lot in common here. And
we want to see people saved in a saving
do.
relationship with Jesus Christ.
We do.
And what I hope is that we'll, in a contagious way, show some people some holy envy. Not that you have to become Adventist, but just like I was trying to teach my students to increase their religious literacy so they could see a mosque and say in the Islamic faith and say, you know, I really admire how dedicated they are to prayer, right? I mean, that was one of my takeaways. I wasn't trying to become a Muslim, or I wasn't trying to have my students, but just to have a literacy. And what I hope by people listening to this is that they'd have a little holy envy, not that we're trying to convert anyone that's listening, but just to say, hey, you know, Adventists really, their emphasis on health is really significant. They tend to live longer, and that's really cool. You know, that's something I can really admire and appreciate. And so hopefully we can introduce a different side of Adventism, Adventism at its best, as I like to say, but in a way that can be capable of a little bit of holy envy, so you can see there's more to the story, and see Adventism, those sides that are admirable, and recognizing all of us have our shortcomings. Adventism and all religions, you know, all religious groups have their shortcomings, but can we see kind of more to that story, more to that picture?
And I would like for them, for outsiders, those outside of the Adventist community, to see the whole story and say, okay, this is what you really believe. You know, I think that we have some things in common. However, there's a number of things I completely disagree with you on. But as long as they know what they're disagreeing with, that this is what we really believe, and then they say, okay, I don't agree with that, but you know what? Your health message, as you just said, Michael, and other things, you guys have some really positives, and I can respect Adventist, even though I don't agree with Adventist.
So
that
Jud,
to me would be respectful.
You basically want them to come to the conclusion that Walter Martin did.
Pretty much. But, you know, if you listen to the last two podcasts episodes of the podcast, where the focus is Adventism occult. There's two parts on that after the earlier two parts on the Ellen White and the Millerites. And that's where they deal with Walter Martin. And the sense you get is that the proclamation people are trying to change Walter Martin's conclusion. In other words, undermine Walter Martin's conclusion. He had it wrong that Adventists were Christian. But what Walter Martin, you're exactly right. Walter Martin disagreed with Adventists, but he respected Ellen White. He respected Adventists as Christians. And that, I think, that's been a good thing throughout the latter part of the 20th century to now. Although I tell you what, if evangelicals continue to listen to this one-sided version of the proclamation, it is going to reverse that. And that would be unfair. And that's why we need to speak out.
Yeah.
Love it. Love it. Well, I think we've covered a great introduction to what we're hoping to do over the next couple episodes, and we're going to be delving a little bit deeper. So I just want to thank our listeners for joining us as we just kind of begin, and we're going to kind of, and we look for some feedback. Leave some comments online. We'd love to know what you're thinking as we delve through this. So, so thank you for listening and joining us for this special, I don't know what we're going to call this, Adventist Pilgrimage, Adventist History Podcast bonus, Ellen White podcast, but the family network of Adventist History Podcast, that we can spend a little bit of time having this little round robin table as we kick off this little mini series on Adventist, I guess, apologetics.
I vote we call it the Grand Council of Apologetics. That's right.
All right. Well, I'm glad we didn't go to any other grand councils. So, anyways, thanks for joining us and listening. And come back and join us for another episode each month.
For sure. Hope so.
All right. This is gonna be fun, guys.
And Jesus himself said that he did not come to do away with the law.
He does not take us out of this world if he does not want us to be contaminated by it.
Hey, I wanted to let you know that the Loma Linda Institute of Worship is offering a worship leadership certificate to help leaders and pastors take their congregation's worship experience to the next level. This August 9th through 12th event will include presenters like Randy Roberts, Adriana Pereira, Nicholas Zork, Wayne Buckner, Richard Hickam, and more. And it will also provide the opportunity to perform on stage with Steve Green and the Heritage Singers. So come sing, pray, write new music, share testimonies and resources, and grow together with like-minded worship leaders from across the world. All Adventist History Project podcast listeners will get 10% off when you use the promo code HISTORY at checkout. So head on over to lliw.net to register.